Hello, this is Michael McCarthy, and in this video we're going to take a look at using Phoenix FD to render particles using the point system. Now, in our last video we looked at fragmenting a pillar and creating some smoke and using those particles that are created with Phoenix FD and rendering them with the foam system. In this case we have just a basic 3ds Max P-Flow particle system, and it could really be even just a general Max system. And it has some swirly particles that have been created with some basic wind and drag operators. So if we go in here, go into particle view, you can see that we just have a birth event with 80,000 particles, and we have some basic speed and force in here. So real basic setup. We'll go to frame 300. And you can see what we have here. Now you may want to kind of blur these out. We're rendering quite a bit of particles here. So let's go into particle flow, and what you might do is just use a basic image blur or something like that. So if I enable image motion blur, set that to something like 3. Now when we render that out, we'll get some nice blurry particles. But of course with image motion blur, you're probably not getting the richness, and we could certainly use a few more particles, but we're going to start to be at our limit pretty quickly. So let's take this in to Phoenix FD and render it out there. In order to do that, we're just going to go and create geometry. From the drop down, we'll pick Phoenix FD and choose Phoenix Foam. So we'll just drag this out. In the Modify panel, under Particle Systems, we can click Add. So previously we added our Phoenix Simulator. In this case, we're just going to pick these particles. So we'll choose the Swirling Particles event, and you can see that you can choose a number of different events here if you wish. And now we're going to be able to render out using our point rendering mode. I'm going to change the color so it's not up against that white background. I'll change it to that same kind of darkish blue. And let's turn off the rendering ability in particle flow. So under geometry here, I'll just set this to none. And we'll do a quick preview render. Now you can see we get much finer detail on all of these little dots in here, and a much smoother kind of setup, much more pleasing than what we had before. Let's go and tune some of these parameters. So if I select this and I go over here, we can change the color, we can change the refractive index, and if we up this a little bit to, let's say, 4, we're going to get a little more body out of what we had rendering here. You can see it renders very quickly, and also if you'll notice, we're rendering with scanline, so that's not a problem through this either. We could also increase the diffuse multiplier if we want to kind of see a little bit more of these. If I crank that up to 2, it'll be a little bit more blue, and it'll be maybe easier to see some of these on the ends. Now the next thing we want to do is add our motion blur, and for that we're going to go over to V-Ray. So let's go to V-Ray, assign a renderer. I'm going to just drop our subdivs down here. We'll do a quick render just to see how V-Ray renders this. We'll close our old frame buffer. So there we go there with no motion blur. We'll scroll down to camera and enable motion blur. So this is getting all the velocity information that P-Flow is providing. So we'll have good motion blur here. Click on render. And you can see that we get that motion blur, which is very nice. Now in this case, because the motion blur is creating more points for us, we're getting a thicker volume, and we can probably bring our refractive index back down. So we'll set that to 2. And maybe bring that diffuse multiplier down to maybe a 1.3. Do another quick render. That's looking much better. Now we can even increase the blurriness here using the velocity multiplier. So let's just crank that up to 3. And we'll see we get much more blurry particles. That's giving us a nice smooth blur all the way throughout. And if we want to actually even increase the amount of particles we have, we can go down under point and motion blur steps. If we make it larger, what's going to happen is we're actually going to get less particles. So that's decreasing the amount that we'll have. You'll see it'll start to kind of thin out a little bit. But if we bring this down to something below 1, like a 0.5, then we're going to start to get more particles generated by the motion blur, which is going to smooth out what we see here. So we can kind of go back and forth and play with these things. Another nice option that we have here is the size variation, and you can set this to be by particle age, and the controlling property here is really the size variation. So let's vary this with a value of 10, and these should actually get bigger in general. And what will happen is, as they kind of are a little bit older, they'll get a little bit smaller. What we can do is bring our refractive index down some, so maybe a 1.3. Now these guys at the end are really kind of fading off. Finally, if we want to increase our particle count even more, we can go to the count multiplier, which is currently in the nightly builds, and we can increase that. So let's set the count multiplier to 3, and what that's going to do is multiply our overall particle count and disperse those particles throughout the particle system. So there you can see we get some nice detailed rendering with motion blur and a raised particle count using both our motion blur and the new count multiplier. Hopefully this helps you render out your particles if you're using any particle system with Phoenix FD. Thank you very much.